Olá a todos. Olá a todas. Hello, everybody. Today we have a special guest. We have Adolfo Córdova. And before I introduce him, I'm going to say a few words about Ninho, the association that is promoting this event. Event is part of the Lucupesa Reading Nests program by Culturicescos Ninho. Ninho aims at improve diversity and multiculturalism in the children's culture sector in Finland. To create a network of people interested in fostering children's literature and inherited language. If you are interested, please leave your email with us and we can get in touch to let you know about future projects, events. And we would like also to invite you to another training event for reading mediators in November. So 5 of November and 12 of November from 11 o'clock until 3:30 with Ivone Carlos. It's in English also and free of charge. Please leave your email with us. And for those who are online, you can leave your email by a private chat. Okay? So let me introduce you. Thank you for coming. Muito obrigada. He's a writer, a journalist, researcher, and reading mediator born in Veracruz, Mexico, but based mainly in Barcelona and Mexico City. And he holds a master's degree in books and literature for children and young adults. Very nice. And you have a that you have worked on the Centro de las Artes de Austin. It's one. And you can introduce better and say because a lot of institutions. So the International Youth Library in Germany, you have collaborated, and Center for Studies for Promotion. Spain, so a lot of experience. And in Spain, you have been also a visiting professor at the University of Castilla-La Mancha. Yeah, and University of Salamanca also, and the University of Barcelona. And his books have been translated into Catalan, German, English, and Nutayayu. You can expand better. But it's really interesting. And he received a lot of awards also. So be free to share with us all your experiences and your blog, because you have a blog also. Yeah, Linternas y Bosques.
Linternas y Bosques.
So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. Dicen que de la selva nace todo lo que anda y lo que parpadea, lo que comes y lo que acecha, lo que cubre, lo que truena y lo que un día te devuelve a las fauces de Chane, el dios de la tierra. Bueno, good afternoon. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. How do you say like Hiba Ita? Buenas tardes en finlandés. Huba Ilta. Thank you. I'm really excited to be in Finland for the first time and to share part of my work and be here with you, Patricia. And of course, thank you to Ninho, to Laura, to Adriana, who was really helping me in every last minute of this presentation. And of course, Yvonne, who you mentioned, he's going to do a presentation, who originally contacted me. Thank you for everybody. Like I'm really thankful of this interest of the city of Helsinki and the Spain Embassy on multicultural approach for a society that we need, especially now. And I would also want to thank Homeshuk, which is this child and God that I will tell you about. for letting me tell her story. And also I want to thank my grandmother and my grandfather and the grandfathers and grandmothers in general, because I think they're the guardians of the memory. And of course, also my brother, who told me for the first time this story, Homshuk. And since sound is a special feature of this presentation, I'm going to read some poems in Spanish, and you will see the translation into English on the screen. Okay. Dicen que de la selva nace todo lo que anda y lo que parpadea, lo que comes y lo que acecha, lo que cubre, lo que truena y lo que un día te devuelve a las fauces de Chane, el dios de la tierra. Una vez de la selva nació también un llanto fuerte, como el chasquido del mono, como el aullido del mono, como el chasquido de 1000 chicharras, como el olor de un animal muerto. Era Homshuk, un niño que lloraba bajo el sol, en la tarde, la noche completa. Homshuk, oye cómo suena. Tanto lloraba que su madre, que no tenía comida para darle, ni con qué cubrirlo, ni una canción para arrullarlo, lo molió en el metate. Lo hizo bolita y lo tiró al río. 1 y 2 vueltas dio la bolita de niño molido que era Homshuk, 1 bajando y 2 al fondo del río, cuando un pez barrigón abrió la boca y se lo tragó de un solo glup. Homshuk, en la panza del pez, hecho bolita, hecho huevo, le ordenó que lo devolviera al río. Ahora mismo, en este instante, ya, gritó. El pez barrigón se asustó. Nunca le había hablado nada dentro de la panza, ni fuera, ni bajo las escamas, ni entre las espinas, y lo escupió. Y esperó Homshuk bajo el agua, hecho huevo, abrazado por las piedras limosas, arrullado por las olas del río y sin muchas ganas de nacer. Homshuk does not wish to be born. He is just fine the way he is, as if he were in his mother's womb, underwater, sheltered by the waves of the river, but from there he listens and speaks. That is, he already inhabits a language, a certain music. That music, by the way, is not originally Spanish, but Nuntahiji, one of the 364 linguistic variants that exist in Mexico, that are grouped in 68 languages, or linguistic groups. In Mexico, a different language could be spoken every day, and yet, the Mexican state, like many other nations around the world, has been responsible for neutralizing that cultural and linguistic diversity, privileging the Spanish language to the point that today, only 6% of the population speaks a native language. She is Noemi. She is 9 years old and speaks Nuntahiji. And although much of her formal education has been in Spanish, she has a teacher, Emmanuel Rodriguez, who is an activist and defender of the language and has fostered spaces to speak, read, and write in Nuntahiji. He tells the story of Homshuk to Noemi, and I now will tell it to you. Homshuk's mothers live in this desolate landscape that we can see in the first pages of the book. He lives in a desperate situations. That's why she rhymes him. She does not have any food to feed him or means to provide him shelter, not even her words. She does not have a song to lull him to sleep. She doesn't, but the river does. She handles him back to the river, to his environment, to the mother nature, a communal mother, to give him the opportunity to be reborn. And he will be born again. Homshuk will be adopted by two elders, whom he will call grandparents, but later he will discover that they want to eat him. He will then return to his community, and with the help of his uncle and aunts, birds, bats, opossums, iguanas, rabbits, toads, will overcome many dangers by saying his name. Also, by contemplating the landscape, listening to the environment, collaborating with others, and he then will give rise to something new for all of us: corn. Allow me to suggest that the story of Homshuk can be a metaphor for a practice of care, a reading companion in context in which children and their parents have to leave one place to arrive to another, that can feel like bleak at first. In which ways can literature usher and accompany the lives of children growing up in the diaspora? How can we create reading experiences that may stay and endure its impact in the lives of readers? Can language be a shelter? A listening practice is key. It is transversal to all practices that we can think of, including book selection. Listen to the other, listening to the other, actually. Homshuk, matongi, jutsa, ingik. Oye cómo suena. Listen how it sounds. And how do words sound inside ourselves? Inside me, I hear them. I hear songs like tortilla, tlacuache, semilla, metate, taco, murciélago, maíz, ceiba, aguacate, olla, colibrí, chocolate. What words live inside yourselves? What words makes you feel protected? How does the music of your language sound like? It is said that literature for children was born from lullabies. I want to invite you to think a little bit, maybe even close your eyes, you that are online too, and think of those words that makes you feel safe, makes you feel home. Even try to remember a lullaby. And if anyone here in the library, by the way, thank you to the library for having us. This is an amazing place. If anyone here in the library wants to share that music, I would love to hear it. Just a little piece of.
My grandma used to sing us every now and then, daily, I think. And it gave us really peace to my cousin, my sister, and I. She's like, for me, like a strong Mexican woman. She was raised in a ranch, and everyone judges her because she doesn't know how to express feelings, but she sings a lot. So I think every time that's the way of expressing more than something else. So she was singing daily, and I remember just the part. I know the whole song, but the word toronjil, which I really like. And then in the song it says like toronjil de plata, torre de marfil, arrullen al niño que quiere dormir.
Ah, qué bonito.
So,
gracias.
I remember daily that thing.
Thank you. Anybody else? Just the song, just to hear, or some words?
Yeah.
Okay, if you're shy, that's okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's a prayer.
Sure. Go ahead.
But it's in Portuguese.
Yes, please. In your.
And I don't feel like a Catholic, which this prayer is connected to Catholicism, but it goes like this. And I still have it printed in my daughter's pillow. I got it as a present, but it's still in our lives in some way. It goes like this. Santo anjo do Senhor, meu zeloso guardador, se a ti me confiou, a piedade divina sempre me rege, me guarde, me governe, me ilumine. Amém.
Thank you. It's interesting that you thought in a prayer because, in a way, that's a very good example of what we are trying to say. That songs, literature that make words that make us feel home, safe, and sometimes it comes in a form of a prayer. Maybe if people is connected, they can write it in the YouTube or Facebook. And I just wanted to know you a little bit more. That's why I was asking if anybody wanted to share. But I will share an example of this lullaby from Argentina.
Pajarito que cantas en la laguna, no despiertes al niño que está en la cuna. El lucerito de la mañana.
Okay, just a little piece of it. It already made me feel more like home. Homeshuk, just like Tom Thumb, are good listeners. Historically, the one that listens has always been the child, not the adult. And the history of childhood and the history of the literature written for that childhood could be understood as the process of exchanging that role. All the beginning parts of the publications aimed for children and young people in the 18th century are similar. Once upon a time, there was a character who had to learn a lesson. Its aim was educational, not artistic. That is the reason why, in so many places, literature for children was born assisted by institutions such as the church or the state itself. These were editorial projects of religious and/or civic indoctrination that sought to make a template, a mold of a certain childhood according to the morality of an era and the identity character of a nation. The identity character of a nation with the normativity and cultural domination of some languages over the others that came along. Publications that prioritize the aesthetic experience over the moralizing or patriotic discourse, or those that ignore the call for disciplining and instead decided to focus only on enjoyment, constitute the exceptions in those published at the time, and that in the end became the canon, and what we continue to read nowadays. The change towards a kind of literature more sensitive to children's desires was thrust by children themselves. They really push it, who show that fairy tales and adventures, or some other examples of that transition, that they show us that fairy tales and adventure stories were of interest of them, stories that were not originally written for them as an audience or readers. And so, by actually listening to children, writers began creating books that did not just repeat what school and family already told boys and girls. They began making books that celebrated freedom and disobedience, books that allowed them to look at the world critically and take part in building it. Maybe you can recognize some of the characters in the screen. I'm sure you will. And of course, kids doesn't want to read stories that tells them again what to do. And they love listening stories where the characters are doing whatever they want. And they can actually disobey.
Nós temos compartilhamento aqui de uma música que você pediu.
Ah, Thank you, Yvonne from the audience. Duerme, duerme, negrita, que tu mamá está en el campo, negrita, te va a traer muchas cosas para ti. That's what her mother used to sing her. Thank you, Yvonne. This example, for instance, is called La Calles Libres, Streets Are Free, and it's a book where actually the kids demand a park in their neighborhood because there's none, and they get it. We could say, as Daniel Goldin, Mexican editor and specialist in children's literature, points out, I quote, "The evolution of children's literature has gone from being a children's literature, that is to say, a literature to be listened and listened to and accepted, to a children's literature that dialogues and promotes the active participation of children in the world. Desde esta máscara miro que puedo ser un jaguar. Jaguar respiro." To this day, in every library and bookstore shelves of the children's literature section, we can find books that continue both paths of the history of children's literature. Books that reproduce adult-centered models and archaic ideas of childhood, and books that try to engage in a complex dialogue with children, opening up worlds, not closing them. My invitation is to have a historical and critical perspective when selecting books. With each book that we select, we need to ask ourselves, what idea or notion of childhood and literature does this book continue? What books and stories spark and promote conversation, make children want to talk and write their own stories, for instance? Argentinian poet Marilena Walsh would make a clear distinction between these two types of children's literature, using two words, for and with. She said that she wrote with children, not for them. Let's read an example of what she meant by this. En una cajita de fósforos se pueden guardar muchas cosas. Un rayo de sol, por ejemplo, pero hay que encerrarlo muy rápido, si no, se lo come la sombra. Un poco de copo de nieve, quizá una moneda de luna, botones del traje del viento y muchísimo más. Les voy a contar un secreto. En una cajita de fósforos yo tengo guardado una lágrima y nadie por suerte la ve. Es claro que ya no me sirve. Es cierto que está muy gastada, lo sé, pero ¿qué voy a hacer? Tirarla me da mucha lástima. Tal vez las personas mayores no entiendan jamás de tesoros. Basura, dirán, cachivaches, no sé por qué juntan todo esto. No importa, que igual ustedes y yo seguiremos guardando palitos, pelusas, botones, tachuelas, virutas de lápiz, carozos, tapitas, papeles, piolín, carreteles, trapitos, hilachas, cascotes y bichos. En una cajita de fósforos se pueden guardar muchas cosas. Las cosas no tienen mamá. There's a sense, no, of being accomplice.
I have another comment from the audience.
Sure.
Yeah, Babel Hayar say, hello, I love the poetry inside traditional lullabies, sayings and popular culture in general. But as a mother tongue teacher, I feel sometimes the parents' anxiety to pass the culture avoid them, to notice that the kids need to produce their own imaginary. Maybe parents sometimes avoid this kind of texts. I don't know. It's
that's
something that he noticed as a mother tongue teacher.
Thank you. That's totally accurate. I've seen these kind of stories before. Like sometimes when people is not in their hometown, they are even a little bit shy of singing that old songs because they are, as Yvonne put an example, duerme, duerme negrito. It actually, a lot of these lullabies were singing, for instance, for slaves were singing it to resist different oppressions. So the lullabies look innocent, but they are not. They contain a lot of history and political commitment.
And in Brazilian Portuguese, I remember one that it's a bit polemic because it says, boi, 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 boi da cara preta, pegue essa menina que tem medo de careta. So calls some it can be seen like a monster for the kids, like the boy that they call to take the kid from at night. So the kid needs to sleep. If you are awake, you can be taken by this character. So the children can sleep, but afraid.
I mean, but kids like horror stories. We know that. Like when I was writing Homeshook, I read it to a lot of kids from first grade to sixth, and I noticed that the thing that interested the most was the terrific parts, like Homeshook being chased by the sorcerers that want to eat him. But going back to the comment, it's true that lullabies and all this oral tradition, it's part of our heritage, no? As they were, he or she was saying, he was saying, it's where we can take words, and different words can help us think different words, you know, like that's where we kind of nourish. We will get into that actually in the conversation. We'll talk more about that approach. Thank you for the comment. But going back to this particular poem, and of course, Marilena Walsh was taking a lot of the oral tradition. Yes?
Can we ask questions now or?
Yes, go ahead.
It just came to mind because I was wondering also that many of these traditional lullabies and nighttime stories, and you yourself just said, there's an element of fear in of them. And I have wondered before, why is that? Is it, and from which lines of literature this comes from? Is it something that is inspired by the desires of children, or is it a tradition that we inherited from, I don't know, oppressors?
Yeah.
So where does it come from?
Well, there are different.
Why is it that children respond to fear in that way, that they seem to be so interested in?
Well, to be a child is hard, you know, like there's a lot of fears, and there are different theories on that. Some of them would say, just like you suggest, that is a way, like historical way of saying exactly. And some others would say that it's actually a way in which parents would prevent themselves from the loss of the child, you know, like they were already putting out their own fears in the lullaby. So it's not only the child that has fears, but also the adult that is with them. So in a way, the lullaby works as a bridge between the adult and the baby in a common fear, the fear of not surviving, let's say. That's one of the theories. But it's interesting how also the lullabies change over the time, and maybe, well, I will not go deep into that, but yes, in a way, that's we can say now that it's like an old tradition that we right now we don't continue composing a lot of lullabies. That's interesting. That's another question to put ourselves. What happened, no, to that tradition? We don't have any fear anymore, or what happened? It's something to think about. And actually, well, I will just continue with Cajita de Fósforos because Marilena Walsh, she was very aware of lullabies and English stories. He had a part of herself, like an heritage, English heritage. And she wrote a lot of things with rhyme. But this particular poem, and that was already a bet from her, has no rhyme, not in a classic way. And for me, it was surprising to see how much also the poem reflects an idea of childhood that is more open. Let me explain you more particularly why. When I first read her poem in una cajita de fósforos, in which María Elena Walsh keeps all sorts of things, I thought that every word in the poem sounded different from the rest of her poetry and different from most of the poetry for children I knew. I wondered if Walsh in 1965 was trying to speak to a different kind of child, and if this sound would summon, like the Pied Piper from Hamelin, a new group of children away from the old city, away from the traditional forms of poetry, into a wider and more open house of words. And then, for almost 3 years, and with the support of 2 research fellowships, the International Youth Library Munich that you were saying, and Center of Studies of Reading and Children's Literature Promotion, Zeppelin in Spain, I kept poems in a little matchbox, poems that sound different and therefore imagine different readers. The outcome of this research was the anthology Cajita de Fósforos, a book that celebrates 100 years of non-rhyme Ibero-American poetry that imagine a childhood outside the norm, outside the tradition too. It's interesting when we talk about oral traditions and lullabies, how literature today sometimes continue the traditions, but sometimes also breaks it. It's important to think of also ways of going in another direction when we talk about tradition. It was illustrated by Juan Palomino, who was here recently, and published by Venezuelan Spanish publisher Écare. And so, to select the poems, there's some images there. That's a poem from Marina Colasanti, a Brazilian author that Patricia knew very well, but not this particular poem. This particular poem, Marina Colasanti is very well known by her fairy tales, but she's also a poet. This is a really beautiful poem, but we'll just continue. That's another place where Juan Palomino was also narrating, like telling a story with his images. We can see that through the pages. But going back to the book itself and the selection, we know that questions are really important. I would say, actually, today, where I was in Pasila's library, and I asked the children, what do they think happened in the library at night? One of them said that he thought that maybe vampires came out. And I think we were really connected because whenever I talk about questions, I always say that books and vampires are alike. And we have to, as librarians, teachers, mothers and fathers, interview the vampires. We have to ask the book questions, all sorts of questions, and try to see how well they can tell us one story or different stories, for instance. And as some of them, just like vampires, has been here for a lot of time, they are really good answering good questions. So we really have to be critical, because sometimes there are books, very popular books, and not necessarily the ones that we want to work with, because maybe they have a lot of stereotypes, or maybe they promote like a very white approach of the world, or maybe they are telling the children what to do. And it's very popular because parents love books to tell them what to do with their child. They even dare to put color in emotions, some of those on these books. That's a vampire hiding there. So some other questions. So there are different levels of questions. I would say there are some questions that we can ask regarding the story itself. No? How does this story continue traditions or goes in another way, but also the rhythm and the language itself. Is it diverse? Is it rich? Is it complex? And another group of questions could be ideological, like how does this book think of childhood, for instance? What idea of children has this book? What's the reader that the author was thinking? And whenever they address difficult subjects, it's always important also to ask if the author was involved in the story. He was part of the, or she was part of the story that he or she is telling us, or maybe it's just because diversity and multicultural is in the agenda, and maybe the author is going to write about it, but he actually doesn't have a clue of what he's talking about, and he's just taking advantage of some subjects. So we really have to pay attention of the books that we have around. Also, if they are in different genres and formats, and does this book make the reader want to talk? Does this book make the children question themselves? And of course, the book itself, we know this already, is not or should not be the center of the interview, the center of the matter. We live in very, how do you say, like book-centered societies, where everything looks to go around the book. And we have learned that there are at least 2 other key questions to make ourselves, along with what do we read. That would be only one piece of the matter, and it would only actually make sense asking ourselves also at least 2 other questions. For or with whom do we read, and what for do we read? Those are like the tripod, no? Like a very solid platform to make a selection and also to our practices. And in the middle, kids. Or we could say people, not the books in the middle. Because, and I put kids there and not readers. I was hesitating, but I didn't put readers because sometimes kids or people in general may not consider themselves readers. You know what I'm talking about. So it's people in the center. Let's see some example or particularly experience, mediation experience in diaspora context. Reading mediators Jazmín Lozada and Miguel Ochoa told me that in Tijuana, northern Mexico, when working with people who migrated or were forced to migrate, before opening a book and say once upon a time, they begin telling them, that's the welcoming way of doing it. Tell me your story because I want to remember you. That's the first thing they say. Before opening a book, they say, tell me your story because I want to remember you. Their listening practice is a form of welcome. It seeks to erase the imaginary line that separates them. Listening practices guide our gaze, transform it, makes our eyes meet. Another reading mediator from northern Mexico, Nora Obregón, who also works with migrants, but in Monterrey, selects books from the oral tradition that might include riddles, lullabies, sayings, strings, words and sounds that resonate with persons from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, to whom she brings books from her itinerant reading room. As Nora shared with me, it's about enabling your inner library. Laura Debertach proposed, that's a proposal from Laura Debertach, another Argentinian author. Through words, people can summon their community, their home, their families. That's what Nora says. I finished the quote. Going back to the story of Homshuk, it had never been written and published before, although this is like one of the first publications, no? But before this publication, what I mean is that it had never been published before, although it has been widely learned by listening, told by the Nuntahiyi people as part of their oral traditions. The children there, where Noemi lives, don't have books in their own language, to read while growing up. They must learn to read books in Spanish. But that doesn't mean they are less surrounded by stories and poetry. The first book we can share with children and youngsters is a book that began a long time ago and has not been finished, with many different words and stories. Our Memory. Our Memory is a book that we can open when we utter those words. Before actual books, there were voices. Memory was a song. The Aedos of the ancient Greece, and later the rhapsodists and the Celtic bards, the minstrels and the troubadours of medieval Europe, the griots of West Africa, or the Aztec Cuicamatini, were the human libraries and archives, the repositories of identity, the reading rooms who, from court to court, from village to village, invited to a banquet or at the foot of a ceiba tree, told or sang the stories of the people. Many of them, sometimes accompanied by a musical instrument or performing a dance, and they will entertain, move, and bewitch their audiences. They were both loved and feared for the power they exercised to shape history, fix events, legitimize a memory. But each one of us has that power as well, the power of diversify the stories we tell. Grandmothers and grandfathers who tell and give shape to the stories of our families, for instance. Every one of us here. Oh, yes, that's okay. Of us. That is also what the wise character of Mama Lochi teaches her granddaughter Emilia in the extraordinary novel When You Get to the Other Side, Cuando Llegues al Otro Lado, de Mariana Osorio Guma. There's a fragment of it. I quote, "What I want to tell you is what I'm going to leave you, my legacy. It will only be of use to you when you are far away. You will carry with you the history of your family, my history, that of the very hill that is your home, the history of your ancestors, even if you don't know it. And one day, when you miss me and feel that you are about to forget me, you're going to sit down to sketch it all out on pieces of paper, so that the others know about it." Before coming to Helsinki, I read a very inspiring interview from a woman you know very well, who emotionally survived the war by inventing herself another world. When I felt depressed and scared by the bombs and wanted to escape from my grave thoughts, I dragged myself into an incredible world where everything was kind and possible. Tove Jansson. That is also the conviction of the International Research Network Children's Literature in Critical Context of Displacement, directed by the Mexican scholar Evelyn Arispe. She says, "Stories create safe spaces for displaced children and youngsters. Stories bring comfort, weave the present, and open a window into the future." You can find these more of these texts and a lot of downloadables and different tools in that website, and it's actually thought for working with multicultural groups. They have developed a really interesting method with a lot of tools for you to use. So I really recommend that website. In Mexico, for several years, I worked in reading programs in the Biblioteca Vasconcelos, which is similar to Odi in some ways. It really reminds me Odi. That is a really huge place, though. That gigantic site became the fourth most visited public space in Mexico, only after Teotihuacan, Chichen Itza, and the iconic Museum of Anthropology. So it is really remarkable that the fourth site was not touristic, was not just, it was not an archaeological site, was a public library. And how did Daniel Goldin and the team achieve this? How did they manage to transform this library, who was not in the fourth place at all, into a so successful place? Well, Daniel Goldin was talking about radical hospitality. He says, hospitality has to do with dialogue, I'm quoting, with the ability we have to build a space with the others, where people are co-authors, generators of content. In this process, what has moved me the most is how suddenly people discover that their own lives have meaning, that they themselves have value, that they are not merely audience, but actors. I close the quote. That's the, I'm sorry, I was still showing the archaeological sites, but that's the Biblioteca Vasconcelos with their approach of radical hospitality. And that's Daniel Goldin over there and a lot of the things. In Mexico City. In Mexico City. If listening practices can expand a space, that expansion has a poetic dimension that Graciela Montes describes as spaces of imagination and creation. Listening attentively can change spaces and dynamics to the point where one can talk about one's own story and then write it. Listening practices can also be written or drawn. In Palabras de Caramelo, by Spanish writer Gonzalo Moure, a deaf boy can only read lips, but wants to learn to write his name, Cory. And the poems that his friend Caramelo whispered to him. I quote, "The camel, Caramelo, told him about the vast grasslands beyond the sand and the stones, but Cory could not write fresh rivers or sea of grass. It was unfair that he couldn't write Caramelo's words. Cory made himself a shelter." Okay, Caramelo's word, I finished the quote, sorry. So this boy wants to learn how to write even if he cannot listen, because in that way, he will actually write the poems that this camel tells him. It's a really beautiful novel. And actually, Gonzalo Moure is Spanish, but he spent a lot of time in refugee camps, and he met a boy who inspired him to write this story. And Cory, this boy, made himself a shelter inside the refugee camp where he lives with his own poems, which remind him of his wishes. In Stefano, Argentinian writer Maria Teresa Andrueto recreates her own family history, her roots, which stretch out to another language. In her book, a teenage boy inspired in the writer's father, it was Maria Teresa Andrueto's father, immigrates from Italy to Argentina after the First World War, leaving an entire universe behind to merge into another. Stefanos recalls both recalls both nostalgic and critical, makes the reader want to go back and write his own memory. Andretto says, if a book is a way of understanding, a way of penetrating the world and looking for the place that is meant for us in it, Stefano allowed me to regain a sense of ruthlessness, estrangement, of men and women who probably, like those who leave their homes nowadays, arrived here a long time ago looking for a better life. It can also happen that in a reading session, a book speaks first, triggering the possibility for someone to name a situation or experience for which it didn't have a word. That's I'm going to share two books that different reading promoters have told me that they work with whenever they are working with people that have left their homes. This may happen to girls and boys who come across the book Two White Rabbits by Jairo Butrago and Rafael Jokten, which tell the story of a girl and her father on their way migrating from south to north on different types of transportations, including riding the Beast. The Beast is the name given to the train that brings migrants from Central America through Mexico to the US border. Or also the book Antonia Goes to the River by Di Pacho, a Colombian author, in which a very diverse group of people leave their home, crosses a river, and continues now without one of the characters by road. Perhaps children, youngsters, and adults going through any of the diverse forms of migration may identify themselves in one of these stories and turn the page feeling less alone. None of these publications, though, hide the difficulties and the harshness that migrants undergo, but the treatment is smooth, full of care, and leave plenty of room for readers to make their own conclusions. For persons who are going through these situations in the present time, it might be safer to read words that do not resonate directly with their reality, using metaphors, or any illustrated book that may bring hope. And of course, silent books are a really good tool to achieve that. It is said that every story is the story of an encounter, of a meeting, and of a search, of a journey towards something else. So many different books, even if they don't say migration in the cover, many different books can be good for exercising a listening practice with children growing up in the diaspora. Noemi, I'm heading to the end of the conference and going back to Noemi. Noemi, the Nintahiji girl that I mentioned earlier, lives in the community where she was born. She has not migrated, but she had never read a book in her language before, as I told you. They were, for her, neither the books nor her reading experience signified a space of her own or a refuge. For her, the books doesn't mean refuge or home. The books are for school. Only that. They were, in any case, a passage, a foreign house, written in a language other than the one in which her parents speak to her. But a few months ago, we succeeded in our petition to Castillo Ediciones, the publishing house of Hamshuk, to create a small print run of the book in Nuntahiji, the original language of the myth, with a translation made by Noemi's teacher, Emmanuel Rodriguez, that we saw at the beginning. And a few weeks ago, we did a presentation of the book at the International Book Fair in Jalapa, the capital of the state of Veracruz. Noemi traveled 9 hours with her mother and her teacher to get there. When I gave her the version of Homeshuk published in her language, in the midst of the fuss of the fair, she forgot about the journalists, the staff, and everything around her. She opened the book, as we can see there, and as we can see in the previous photo, and began to read it. While her teacher was being interviewed, Noemi read and read. Until the moment of the presentation, Noemi was still reading. It was the very first time that she had in her hands a book written in her language, Nuntahiji. Noemi was part of the book presentation with me and Professor Emmanuel, and she read her favorite chapter of the book. When Homeshuk returns to his house with his mother, the one who has previously ground him, his mother was scared in the story because she thought that Homeshuk was mad at her and was going to take revenge. But all Homeshuk wanted was to rest, sleep in her arms, safe at last. That's the chapter that Noemi chose. And she only made one more comment during the presentation. She only read her favorite chapter and then made one comment. And the comment that she made during the presentation was to say she recommended the book to children because Homeshuk faced 1,000 dangers, and that would make the children feel brave. That's the only thing that she said. Me hace sentir valiente. It made me feel brave. That was the only thing. Her synthesis of what many boys and girls look for in books could not have been more representative of what I wanted to share with you this afternoon. The revolution for Noemi, the reason why this book meant so much to her, was not only because she was reading a book in her own language for the first time. It was not only that, it was also because it is a story that reaffirms her and the jungle where she lives, her environment, with a child just like herself growing up in a world of adults. It's not only because she was reading her language, but also because she was actually seeing herself, her place, her context. And also because Homeshuk is also a kid that made his way along with others that are like himself and that are also trying to kind of build a family against a power that is bigger than them. Because remember that Homeshuk needs help from other animals to get rid of the abuelitos that wants to eat him. Therefore, it is not enough to translate foreign books into native language spoken by a minority in a country. It's also important to look for books originally written in that language and that convey a childhood perspective and from within the world they live. And if such books don't exist, we need to write them. Shortly after Homeshuk's presentation at Jalapa Book Fair, Professor Emmanuel sent me these photos where we can see some of Noemi's classmates with books written and illustrated by themselves. The whole process of reading a book for the first time triggered in them and in the professor the desire to create. Their books are available in the little classroom library so that other kids can read them and, of course, make their own. Taking refuge in language means not only reading, but also creating in that language. Let's make children participate in the co-creation and selection of books and the co-creation of reading spaces. Homshuk returns to his house as a giver as well, not only as a child. He gives her mother the corn. He transformed his reality, and a reality that had crushed him, and recounts another destiny, a richer and more diverse destiny, a more loving one. Reading and writing, literature is one's own language. In one's own language is political, to read and write in our languages. It gives children and us the courage to face this world in which, although we may not like it, they face 1,000 dangers. It gives them the certainty that they come to a world where not everything is already set up, where they can also participate, create and expand the house in which they live, and reinvent it. And just to finish, I want to share with you another thing that happened this morning. I asked the children how many words do they have? Just like that. How many words do you have? And a kid immediately answered 2. And he even say Finlandia and Alemania. Finland and Germany, and he was speaking in Spanish. So there was at least 3. And there was another kid that was thinking, and he took its time to answer, and then he suddenly said 1 million. Like he had 1 million words. I want to finish like thinking how much this tells of children themselves, that these 5-year-old children show us this morning that he can contain, that inside him, he can contain 1 million words. That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Really inspiring, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia.
We have some comments here, also from the audience and internet, and continue our conversations about the lullabies. Babel wrote again to complete his thoughts. He said that what he meant was that the parents, they have this anxiety of passing their past, what they have lived, their past, their history to be passed to their children. And kids that were born here assimilate things in their one way, in different ways, because they are in the diaspora. So he had a situation when a mother wants that the teacher tells carochinha stories, these stories from our childhood, let's say like this. But the kids wanted to see other things. The mother seems to be stuck in what she considered to be culture. But in diaspora, we transform feelings. What do you agree in some point, or what can you comment on
this? Yes, I will. I think, yeah, that's true. Actually, it's interesting how much it's like there are 2 forces, no? The force of adapting, because we want to adapt to the new place, and children want to do that, and sometimes they manage to go from one world to the other easily. And it's more the worry of the adult that is trying to, as he's commented, to preserve an heritage and to share with the kid that heritage. But it's interesting to think that what the kid has to share with us too. No, I would say that fear of losing the heritage can be shared with the children, and also just ask him what is like the stories that he is listening right now, and try to build a mix of that. You know, the richness of the mixture, not to embrace that. Like, we don't want a conception of pure culture either. I think
Mhm.
like
Okay.
it's hard to I mean, I understand where whenever someone is living in diaspora, identity is really important, no? To keep the identity, to keep it, because otherwise it will maybe disappear. But maybe it can be, we can think about that situation like an exchange of in both directions, where the kid can also help us answer those worries, no? Not to, because sometimes parents have a lot of in their backs, no? Like they have to worry about passing the traditions, but also showing the kid how to adapt. And I normally found a lot of answers whenever we turn the gaze and think, how come children answer to those worries, and how do they deal with traditions and new forms and the conversations that they are having in school and with children that are more present.
Yeah, I think that is really correlated with your idea of telling a story with the kids, writing the books with the kids.
With them, exactly. Not for them,
not
but
for them,
with them. As Marielena Walsh said, that's really a key, I think, for everything, you know, to listen and think that we are side by side. Even if we think that we have to protect them, we are side by side. And I always say that literature for children is also for adults, and sometimes we talk about things that we normally don't talk about because of a children's book that maybe address the death.
Yeah,
no?
that's
For
true.
instance,
That happens a lot.
it happens a lot, and
Yeah.
it's for us to talk about things, not only for children, let's say.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
Amy Christina commented that she likes your two comments that we must become intimate with vampires, and and another comment, if such books doesn't exist, we must write them. She liked those two quotes.
Yeah. Yes, that's something that I mean, it was really beautiful to receive these photos that I shared with you. I kind of saw a little bit all the process of Noemi before. I didn't show you that picture. I didn't tell you about that, but of course, before the translation and before the book was actually printed, the professor worked a lot in the translation, and he sent me a video of Noemi reading the poem in like just in sheets of paper, and to see how she went from there to writing their own stories was a revolution. It was a revolution for her. I believe it was a revolution to make their own books and tell the stories that she wants to tell, and not wait someone else to translate it or someone else to come. And I mean, we need to cooperate, and we expect everybody do its part, but we as librarians, mediators, we can do much more if we open a space that is creative and allows children to create with us.
Yeah, that's true. Adriano, do you have more time? Or
Yes.
Yeah, so if you know any of you want to ask or comment something.
I could ask, perhaps a bit off topic, what are your thoughts about this constant digitalization of content and how the form of the printed book, how does it stay or evolve in our world nowadays and looking into the future? How do you see this? And also in the sense that maybe the digital format is also empowering the children, to cyber natives, let's say, who are very, very fluent in technology. How do you see this format dilemma we live nowadays?
I honestly don't see it as a dilemma. I think, but I understand, and at some point we make ourselves that question: like, should we be promoting reading on screens or not, or like also exactly. Well, there are different experiences. No, reading is an experience. Let's begin with that. Reading is an experience, and it's an experience that can be lived in different contexts and in different supports. It's not the book itself, but the reading. You remember when I was saying in the center of the matter is not the book printed or digital, it's the reader. So the reader is in the center, and he or she may read printed or digital, but also watch TV, listen to music, play a video game. All of this is part of his need of fiction, because at the end we are promoting fiction, we are promoting imagination. Graciela Montes says that more than promote reading, we should promote perplexidad. We should promote perplexity. She says that. And I understand that she's more worried about the reader itself in the middle, taking different formats. And for them, it's natural, as you said, like they will switch into books, music, video games, theater, movies, books very easily. They already read like that, like in a multiverse world. But of course, like in everything, there are opportunities and there are things that we as specialists, maybe we will promote the experience of having a physical copy of a book. But sometimes, for instance, where Noemi lives, they're not really library. Well, they're not libraries at all. Well, there is a little library in their classroom that professor did, and in a big city like 2 hours from her community. But there are, of course, not bookshop, or anything. In a lot of places, remote places in Mexico and in Latin America, they are not books, but they are phones. So there was something missing as promoters of reading if we were not using phones to read literature too. So this was a tool. We realized that some years ago, I was taking part of a project, that this was an opportunity for a lot of children in Mexico to actually read, because there was anything, there were no books. So it can be useful too. I understand your worry, but I think, I don't know what the future is going to look like. I mean, in Audi, I saw a robot taking the books into the shelf, and that was already like a glimpse to the future. And we'll see. But I think books will remain. I mean, that discussion because it's a different experience. Just like radio is coming back in the format of podcast, but at the end is like radio. Is to hear something. So reading books maybe will continue transforming, and I think it will be more connected with everything. It will be maybe more and more interactive, but it is a totally different experience to actually have a book and read it, or to produce a book, smell it, all that. Yeah, I think it will stay. We are surrounded by books. Libraries in Helsinki actually give me hope. Like it looks like there's a big future for libraries still. And as I told you, Biblioteca Vasconcelos, the 4th most visited place in Mexico, just after very touristic places. And people go there, just like libraries we have been visiting here, for a lot of things besides reading books.
Good. Any other comment or question?
I was just wondering about the first of all, thank you so much for your presentation and sharing your talent with us. I was wondering about the theme of finding refuge in language, and thinking about multicultural families who one of the parents maybe live in diaspora, but not necessarily the child. So who would be finding comfort or refuge in the language? And how has been your experience combining that multiculturalism, multi-language, I would say, and how do you deal with that challenge?
That's a very interesting question. I think Laura, Patricia, they could. I will be interested in hear their answer because they have witnessed that more like in firsthand. But I think what you're saying makes me think in another thing. Like what does a child needs to have this moment of reading, of share a reading, and sometimes we as adults have our own agenda and things, and it's us who are living in diaspora and not them. And maybe it's just a matter of letting the child know more about their parents, the people that is there, and making the bond stronger. And it will be important for the children if it's important for the father and the mother. Like I've seen that, like children that didn't experience like a difficult migration, or that they already were born in a second, let's say, in another country, they don't have maybe this eager to talk about it, but it's there. It's always there. So whenever a parents address a subject that seems to be important for them, children will react with. I have seen that they will react with a lot of confidence, and they will want to share that. Sometimes the book selection is not the most important part for the kids. Maybe you have seen that. They want to share a moment with the adult. So if it's a story from the place that they're living or from the place that they come from, it will sometimes be more or less the same if they are sharing a caring moment with the adult. Yes, I think, and also I think, I was mentioning it in the reading, in the presentation, not always parents living in the diaspora wants to share that part of the story with the children. That's true also. They would maybe even hide it. But I don't know what does Laura or Patricia or yourself think about this, but sooner or later that will come out, and books can be there to help us doing that transition. It's not that we need to, I mean, I will never force anyone to address a subject they don't want to talk about. And sometimes parents, it takes it time to be able to talk about things. And I like to think children are really good listeners because they are trained on that. When I was talking about history, children are more used to listen than to talk. So they are good listeners. And whenever the adult is ready, I have seen that they are ready. No? But I don't know if you want to share something else, or why you were asking, why do you have this doubt?
Of motivated by the idea of finding refuge in language, and it dawned on me that, to me, at least with my experience, it's easier to find refuge in story, period, and that will bridge the language. If the language is not the mother tongue, or the mother tongue of the parent is not necessarily with the child is not as strong. Then establish that experience through the story, and then language will eventually follow.
That's interesting. The story first, right? Because of course these particular children don't really feel like their parents' language is their home, or not their only home, probably. So probably they will just look for the shelter that the story itself provides. And it's true that we are looking for places, whenever we read, and sometimes it's just about going and in any other place. even if it's not a particular place. That doesn't mean that they're going back to Mexico whenever they read Spanish words. Every time they read, they will be not looking for that necessarily. Maybe they just want to go anywhere else. This morning we were playing a lot, precisely exercising that imagination, like where you can go inside yourself. But it's true that we need words to sometimes name places. And I agree with you that for that, children will just use the words that they feel more familiar to build their imaginary places in their heads. And maybe they are not very aware if they are in another language or not.
And it's a two-way road also. In my experience, I have a daughter born here in Finland. She's 12 now.
My student from part-time for a while.
Yes, and I noticed that. So she's like a vessel for me to assimilate the Finnish culture, because she's born here, growing up here, going to a Finnish school. And when I found myself open to that, I noticed that she was also more open to hear my stories from my original culture.
Yeah.
So it's a dialogue, really.
There you go.
Because sometimes I think it's only natural as a parent in diaspora that you want to protect your own culture. And you can become a bit defensive about this new culture that you find yourself and your children in. But if we share without fears, then I think everybody grows in the end. Your own culture, and also you learn more about the culture where your child is growing up in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a beautiful idea. I agree.
Also, a reflection about this is maybe thinking about separating, as you were saying, us from them, and in between thinking of us as the same part of the same story. But it's really interesting, because when you're defending, as you were saying, and you're like passing through your own experience of adaptation and letting go the things that bond with you, but they are still like start bonding with something else, but they will never stop bonding with your richness. But then if you transform maybe, and you just keep the thought of adaptation, and also we can also like heritage them the way of thinking about being inclusive, because they feel like also like different in a kind of way, but part of it's like in between of this thing. But if we are asking that, maybe we can teach them with our experience also, like, yeah, it's hard, but they like to hear true words always. And they are prepared to listen. So it's like, if you, as you were saying, if you are really true to them, authentic, they really feel it. And then it's like, we are part of a new something, and we are constructing, and if we want to adaptate and the new culture adopt us, we also have to adopt the new culture, right? And it's difficult sometimes, because sometimes we just watch it as giving up ours, but it's never going to happen, because we have it in our roots. So it's like an interesting way of letting them guide us sometimes, because always the adults want to control, and when we let go, they have always the answers. They are always asking to read the same book. Sometimes it's like, repeat this story, and they are telling a lot in between. So it's like you say, a bonding. So if we find that bond in reading, I don't think it's like, what do we choose? They are choosing for us sometimes. So we just have to let go and start nurturing and sharing our own stories, our own words. And sometimes it's also curious, they are sharing the new ones, and kind of enrich more than divide or try to make it like forcing a new thing. It's more like richness, right? Kind of thing.
Nice. Yeah. Just like listening to, I remember again this kid this morning. He said that he could contain 1 million words. It's just like that. Like, and actually that sounded like a paraphrase of a Walt Whitman poem that says, en español, me lo sé en español, ¿no? Me contradigo, claro que me contradigo. So that would be like, me contradigo, I contradict myself. Of course, I contradict myself.
This is how we met with Laura before. This is how it comes back.
I contradict myself. Of course, I contain multitudes. That's the poem of Whitman, and in a way, it's just to make peace with the idea that we are not only one people, we are not only one world, but a million, no? And kids were really little, like 4 or 5 years old. And when we are little, I think we are more comfortable with that idea. And sometimes I feel like the process of growing up is the process of, like making 1 million worlds into one. So sometimes it's just a matter of really not just like a poetic way of saying it, but really, really put in practice the idea that we can contain 1 million worlds. How can we, as you are saying, share those worlds, like exchange worlds, and without imposing or grounding any of the worlds in the matter.
In Hungarian, just real quick, because I know we have to go, but in Hungarian there's a saying that you have as many souls as you speak languages. And I'm sure it's in other languages as well, but that is a concept that a lot of Hungarians that I met, when they find out the languages that I speak, they would say, it's this idea of you have as many souls inside of you as you speak languages. So I was like,
Can you say it in Hungarian?
Let me think.
Or you're not? Oh, I thought you were.
No. I just want to get az embernek ahány lélek, ahány nyelv, ahány lélek.
Okay.
As many languages, as many souls. Like if you translate literally, so it really locks down, because you're interested in language, like it really locks down the as many, that concept, that this multitude of languages.
And that makes it multiply
Exactly.
the being of being in other places and taking
Yeah.
the richness of other cultures.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's so nice.
Beautiful.
Fantastic. Yes.
Wonderful.
Wonderful discussion.
Hermoso.
I would love to stay here, continue, but unfortunately we need to finish. Thank you very much for
Thank
this
you,
moment.
Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you, the
Muito
audience,
obrigado.
the people at home watching us.
Thank you, Heidi, for all the technical part
Thank
from
you,
the library,
Colibri.
Colibri
For
and the library. Thank you all. Gracias a todos.
Gracias. I would like to invite again for the next training event on 5 and 12 of November with Ivone Carlos. Please, if you want to come, leave your email with us in the chat or here also. Thank you.
It's training for parents too?
It is. Anyone is. It's for mediators, and anyone is welcome.
Or to build less of storytelling.